Hey everyone, so I just wanted to quickly go over the differences between Raspberry Pis and ESP32s. So both of them have microcontroller capabilities and there are countless differences, but I'm going to focus on the most important differences, I guess, especially if you're using them to build something, even more so if it's something in production, etc. Right, so first of all, this is a Raspberry Pi 3A Plus. This is a single board computer which can run Linux as well as FreeBSD and similar OSs. So the Raspberry Pi itself is actually fairly compact. Let me just quickly show you an example of an ESP32. Okay, so this is an ESP32 W Room 32, right? So this one is made by Adafruit. So first off, I just want to point out that ESP32 is an IC, an integrated circuit. So this little chip here, this silver rectangle there, that's ESP32 itself. And then that black part is its antenna. Not sure if you'll be able to see it clearly in this lighting. Right. So the rest of the board is to provide an interface for debugging the ESP32 via USB and for GPIO capabilities as well. So that enables you to attach all of these pins that you're seeing there, which is why I was able to connect my battery to it with regular pin plugs so easily. These. Right, so that's just this is just an 18650 cell, Panasonic NCR 18650B that I used to power it. So conveniently, this one, which is a ESP32 Feather or Huza 32, has a battery port, which makes it easy for me to power it with a single lithium-ion cell or lithium polymer cell, and it can also recharge the battery itself if you connect an external power source. And so ESP32 is this leads us to the first difference, which is power consumption. ESP32's power consumption, it varies because it uses a processor and there are different peripherals, some of which are on, some of which are off, and there are different settings, but is 500 milliamps or upwards usually at 3.3 volts. So a Raspberry Pi, on the other hand, is more complicated to power, although that's because it has a significantly more powerful processor, which is a quad-core, this one, quad-core 1.2 gigahertz, if I remember correctly, or it might be 1.4 actually, I'm not sure, but this is a Raspberry Pi 3A Plus. So this is a smaller version of the Raspberry Pi 3B. The 3B was the flagship at the time, but in general the B series tends to be more substantial in terms of what it offers. So Raspberry Pis are more suitable for video applications. They even come with HDMI ports, and the B series comes with an Ethernet port too. But back to power consumption. So the Raspberry Pis in general are more difficult to power because they consume they require a 2.4 amp power supply at least in order to avoid low voltage warnings. And so that would look like this if we're gonna power it the wall outlet. It could be bigger or a little bit smaller depending on the charger. And you can battery power a Raspberry Pi, however you would need a relatively large battery, as in much larger than the battery used for this ESP32. So something more along the lines of this, although it's possible that you may be able to use a smaller battery than this though. But yes, in terms of capacity, you need enough to provide a Raspberry Pi with the 5 watts and up to 10 that you may need during operation. So, and Raspberry Pis are 5 volts also. So ignore everything else that the Raspberry Pi is attached to and mounted to. It's just this green board here. I screwed it down to that for another project. And I wanted to show you another ESP32. So this brings me to size. So aside from the fact that an ESP32 can be powered by a significantly smaller power source than a Raspberry Pi, which is going to matter for applications in which you have a very limited power source. So you might even have a tiny project that you might want to mount outside somewhere, or away from a power outlet. So in that case, ESP32s are very useful because they help to bridge the gap between Raspberry Pis and microcontrollers, and most microcontrollers, because an ESP32 has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi built in, as well as Bluetooth Low Energy, which is BLE. So that enables you to achieve internet connectivity and to build IoT projects while still maintaining a very low power consumption. So let me just get out this even smaller ESP32. So this one is called Beetle, right? So as you can see, it's actually the same chip. Huh? Let me just see if I can focus here. ESP32 double room 32D. So this one is slightly different, but it's almost identical pretty much to the one used in the Adafruit Feather. So the difference here is that this board is smaller, it's a more minimalistic design. So as you can see, it's tiny, it's very compact. So this opens a window of opportunity to use it in small projects, even smaller projects rather, especially if thickness is a high priority. But it still has a USB port for easy debugging and programming, and it still has Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and Bluetooth Low Energy, and it has the same 240 MHz dual-core processor as the Adafruit Feather. So this one doesn't have any pin headers attached to it, so I can't just plug its GPIO pins into anything I want. Off the bat, I'd actually have to solder to it, but that's not really a major issue. But the Adafruit, to be fair though, does come without these headers attached. So by headers, I'm referring to, let me see if I can get a better view. So yeah, these rows of pins here, yeah, Adafruit shipped them with a board just in case I wanted to attach them to it. So I decided to attach them to it after a while by soldering, and that was the best way forward for me for this project. Right, so let me just compare the size of this one to the Raspberry Pi. It's a substantial difference. So significantly smaller and significantly lower power consumption. So all of that comes in handy, but another important practical consideration is unintended power loss. So if, for example, there's a power outage and you don't have a Raspberry Pi hooked up to a backup battery, then what's going to happen is the operating system which you have running on it, which will most likely be Ubuntu, Debian, BSD, or Windows 10 if you got that to run properly on it, that won't shut down properly, and it might not even be able to start back up unless you repair the OS or install it. So that's a little inconvenient, especially if you're doing something that requires a high level of reliability and little to no downtime. So the ESP32 comes in handy as long as you're not dealing with any video related applications. So it starts right back up running your app when you reconnect the power to it. So a power disruption really isn't an issue for an ESP32. It just comes right back online almost instantly. So that's very helpful. The Raspberry Pi, you have to reboot it. That takes time as well. So boot times actually add up to downtime. And there's also the fact that it uses an SD card, which presents a potential reliability issue as well. SD cards are the longest lasting data storage mediums. Although the SD card in Raspberry Pi means that you can actually add quite a bit of storage to it. Theoretically, you can add up to a terabyte of storage to using an SD card. So with the ESP32, it doesn't have that much storage. This one comes with 4 megabytes of built-in flash memory, but nonetheless, for its intended purpose, that actually works just fine. Right, so you see that you can power these two either with an external power outlet or with a battery. In the case of the Raspberry Pi, the battery is going to end up being more expensive and more bulky than it would be for the ESP32, but it's important that you choose whichever one is best for your application, because I'm not saying that one of these is superior to the other. The ESP32 is more suitable if you're not using for video related applications and you need an analog to digital converter and serial communication. Raspberry Pi has serial communication though, and also, all the GPIO functionality in a tiny package. So cost-wise, well, that's not the most important thing. This Raspberry Pi cost me $25 actually, and this ESP32 cost me $22 at the time. Although Raspberry Pi Foundation's objective seems to be overwhelmingly to keep price as low as possible for accessibility's sake, and the ESP32 is more for makers, people who are building things. So yes, if you need to build a set-top box, then obviously a Raspberry Pi is what you need, not the ESP32. And if you want something like a low-cost desktop computer, that would be the Raspberry Pi as well. If you want to control a light switch via Wi-Fi and you want it to be compact and you want to hide it inside a wall or something, the ESP32 is better for that. The Raspberry Pi also generates a significant amount of heat too. You do have to be more careful with the Raspberry Pi. From a cooling standpoint, you need to ensure that it has some form of airflow. Even if it's passive, you just need to ensure that it has ventilation, that air can pass through it, and under certain circumstances, if you're doing CPU intensive applications, you may want to put a heatsink on top of the Raspberry Pi. It's a Broadcom chip, so the processor, among other parts, are inside a little silver, underneath that little silver cover there. So it's a Broadcom system on a chip, right? So the Raspberry Pi, interestingly, it's somewhat similar to the ESP32 in that most of the components are actually on that little Broadcom chip, and the board provides the interfaces with which you can connect a monitor, power source, headphone jack, LCD, GPIO, etc. So these are the GPIO pins. There are 2 rows of them. Right, so yeah, I think that covers most of the differences. So if you need something that will come back online right away and it's not likely to fail easily due to a power outage, then the ESP32 is definitely ideal if you're comparing it to a Raspberry Pi, of course. Oh, also another perk of the ESP32 is that you can use either the ESP-IDF, which is the low-level development framework that can be used to develop programs for the ESP32, or you can actually use Arduino's framework, which is extremely user-friendly, especially in terms of reducing the amount of code that you have to type, etc. But both of them have their advantages. ESP-IDF provides more control over the components of the ESP32, and you may find yourself using it if you're writing more complex programs in which you need intricate control over, how a timer behaves or how the ADC behaves, etc. So those are all things to consider. Raspberry Pi has the brilliant advantage of running standard Linux desktop operating system. So it also has PWM and standard GPIO functionality. So that standardization has enabled it to run. And well, yeah, I'm not going to get into too many details here, but Raspberry Pi Foundation built it in such a way that you can use many different languages to write GPIO controlling programs for the Raspberry Pi. You can use C, you can use Python, Node.js, and the long list goes on. So if you're familiar with any of those languages, it's convenient. Because of that, I actually used Node.js to write an IoT app that enabled me to control it with another Android app that I wrote over the internet. So I was able to use that to do things like control appliances. So I could use it to switch the power on or off to to a light bulb, or to control the individual parts of an appliance, such as a air conditioner or a washer. So you might find yourself developing quite a few things, even impressive things, in very little time using Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi is absolutely brilliant for that kind of thing. ESP32 is also leading in that category because of its support of the Arduino framework. Because Arduino's framework enables you to do quite a bit with very little code, and is very straightforward English-like code. It uses the C programming language, but the libraries and wrappers are very user-friendly and beginner-friendly. So all of these use easy-to-use platforms, and you'll find yourself building awesome things in no time. Thanks for watching.